And I'm going to work on taking that membrane off the back here. Using a butter knife just to kind of work some of it away from the ribs. And then once I get some separated, I can use a piece of paper towel. And then just work it off of the bones.
Gross. And that's a membrane, right? So it should all just come off?
Yeah. It comes off pretty easy. Sometimes it shreds, but like you can see, it just came off in a strip. You don't want to use a sharp knife because then you're just cutting tiny, tiny pieces off at a time. And I'm going to use a boning knife just to trim off some of this fat here. That's not something that's going to be any helpful. It's just going to dangle over the fire, get burned. So we're just going to trim that off. We got some fat over here we can get rid of.
What kind of fat is that? It and turn it into lard?
I don't know. Want to try?
I don't know.
Yeah, this has a lot
that's
of
a
fat.
big chunk of fat. Welcome home. Just in case Jonathan slices his finger off.
Alright, so we worked off a good portion of that fat. And there's still some skin in here, but what I'm going to do, on the spare ribs, there's this like flap of meat here. It's not good for the actual ribs cooking process itself, but it's still pretty tasty. So I like to cut that off and just throw that in the smoker just for a delicious meat snack later. So you can see
we're going to be eating ribs for like the next 3 or 4 days.
Pretty easy.
And I'm so excited about it.
I'm feeling pretty good at how this is looking. Let me just move my meat snack aside. And this is all fat that I trimmed off. I'm just going to trim off a little bit of this fat as well. That way when we actually put our rub on, it just kind of goes into the meat, not just soaks the fat.
Brown sugar, kosher salt, garlic, black pepper, coffee, oregano, and natural spices. So that's the flavor profile we're going with.
And I'm just cleaning up the ribs over on this side. And just using the boning knife. There's some chunks on the fat on the cap here. We're just going to trim that off, because no one wants to eat a mouthful of fat. And cut some of this away as well. Alright. Feeling like we got this trimmed nicely. One thing that I'm going to do, because our smoker is small, is I'm actually going to cut this rack in half. So I'm just kind of finding a bone right there in the middle. And then just cutting them in half so that way we can put one on the top rack, one on the bottom. Alright, just like we did with the brisket the other day, I'm applying some mustard to it, and that's going to help the rub stick to the meat. Just rubbing my meat. Alright, now it's the fun part. Gotta coat them nicely. Just every surface you want to coat with some rub. I like to push it in just so it really gets a nice adherence to the meat. Alright, I'm just gonna use it our meat sticks. So that's going to be a delicious snack later. While you're cooking, you get hungry, and it takes a long time for these ribs to cook, so you need something that's tide you over. So I usually buy a snacking sausage. But these, since we have these nice little thin cuts, those will be ready way before the ribs are ready. So you got a built-in snacking material. When it comes to ribs, I usually don't check the temperature, just because cooking it that long, you know it's above the FDA recommendations. Usually I give them the bend test, and we'll show everyone what that's about later. But you just kind of see how good they bend when you pick them up with your tongs. To build our fire, we first started with these wax cubes that Weber makes, and we started off with 2 of them. And as you can see, we poured some charcoal all around and on top of those to get our fire started. Those lighter cubes, all you have to do is light those cubes, and it kind of gets everything else caught on fire and start burning. It made getting the fire started way easier. If you saw our video where we made brisket, it took forever to get the fire started. We were trying different things with cardboard and dryer lint. These lighter cubes were fantastic. They got the fire started immediately. As you can see, very little trouble, and once the fire got started, the charcoal's caught like instantaneously. So let's take a look at those sexy, sexy flames. As I got the fire started, I realized that I forgot to put the fire ring around the charcoal. That just helps keep the charcoal contained, make sure that there's plenty of space between the fire and the edge of the smoker, and it also has holes to make sure that it can still get some airflow through that fire ring. Once the coals caught and they started developing a little ash, I added some organic lump charcoal on top of that. I got everything started with just regular charcoal briquettes, and those are really good to get the fire started, but for really clean flavor, I prefer using the organic lump charcoal. I find that it just has a cleaner flavor to it. And then once I added that on top, I added our wood, which is really going to impart that smoky flavor. I used a few chunks of hickory. That's going to be the base flavor of the smoke that I'm using is hickory. It's really good for pork because it's not too mild that it gets lost. It's not too heavy that it overpowers the meat. It's really a nice balance. And then on top of that, I added a little bit of maple wood as well, just to kind of give the smoky flavor a little subtle hint of sweetness. The smoker that I'm using is a Weber Smoky Mountain 14-inch smoker. It's pretty basic, it's very simple to use, but it requires a little bit of assembly when you're using it. Inside, there is a water pan, and that serves a couple purposes. The water pan, you just fill it with water, and it acts like a thermal barrier between the fire and your food, because smoking is an indirect cooking method, so you don't want your food right above the fire, because that means it's going to burn. It's going to have too much heat. So the water pan acts as a thermal barrier between those two things, so that if grease drips out of your food, it doesn't hit the fire and start flare-ups. And the other thing that it does is help regulate the temperature, keep things from fluctuating too wildly. Since water absorbs heat, it kind of keeps everything in check, so that way you don't get some wild temperature swings while you're cooking. Once we hit our target cooking temperature, of 225 degrees, it's time to add the ribs to the smoker. This is where the magic happens. Our smoker has 2 levels to it, 2 cooking racks, an upper and lower level. It really doesn't make any difference as far as what goes on what level. The temperature is pretty even between the two. So we put 1/2 of ribs on the lower cooking rack, 1/2 on the upper cooking rack, and once they are on, we add our meat snacks to that. And once everything's in, we put the lid on it and then just let it cook. From that point forward, you're pretty much just coasting. We will add some mop to the ribs, we'll add some sauce at the very end, but essentially from this point forward, we just let them cook for 4 to 5 hours. Every 40 minutes, it's a good idea to add a mop to your ribs. This makes sure that your ribs don't dry out. Ribs, it's a very thin piece of meat, so it could easily dry out, especially if you're cooking it over a 4 or 5 hour period. You don't want that to happen. You want nice, juicy ribs. So it's a good idea to add a mop. We're using a sauce from Voodoo Chef called Fat Boy. It's a vinegar-based sauce, so it's going to have a little bit of bite, and that's going to really help balance that really fatty texture of these spare ribs that we're using. So we do this every 40 minutes throughout the 4 to 5 hour cooking process. Once the ribs start to develop a dark color on the outside, you're getting close to the finish line. Just using your best estimate, when you have about 30 minutes left in your cook, it's time to start saucing up those ribs. This gives that sauce some time to set. You don't want to add it too early because otherwise it'll get too caramelized. The actual sugar in your sauce will start to burn. If you start at the very end, if you start too late, then it just gets too sloppy. So you want to do it about 30 minutes prior to the end of your cook, so it gives that sauce some time to set, make it sticky but not too messy. We're using my favorite sauce for ribs. You can find it pretty much anywhere. It's called bone sucking sauce. This is the thicker style. It really does a good job sticking to those ribs. It has a really good flavor, really sweet, really garlicky. It's really an awesome sauce. So we're gonna do this about a half hour before we are done with our ribs. All right, here we are.
Ta-da!
Ba-boom! Ribs.
Ribs, 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 ribs.
The bend test is that you know they're done if they're bending but not breaking. So you can see there's a little bit of jiggle to them, but they're not like coming apart. If they start coming apart, like if you start seeing some cracks in the crust, then that means they're too well done. But right now, they're looking pretty good. All right, this guy's looking especially nice. Okay, so let's take a look at that bend again. They're kind of solid, but a little bit bendy. If they were breaking, then that means they're too done.
Look at that crust.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some ribs.
So here we are at the very end. Just take a look at those ribs. Take a look at that smoke ring. You can see how juicy that meat is, how smoky it is, and let me tell you, these ribs turned out phenomenal. They were so delicious. Definitely, being that they're spare ribs, they've got some fat on them, you can see that, but they came out so good, so tender, so juicy. It was a phenomenal recipe. So this is it. Take a look at these ribs, and thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back with some more maximum effort meals.